I like the history of Pill. Yeah, there's lots of people doing some good work here, you know.
Probably the most special thing for me about living in Pill is belonging to Pill, is feeling that there's a place that I can identify with back through history and the stories that have been told through history to me. I feel as though I know the people in them, and to me that's unique.
I've always found it a very lovely place, and I'd hate to have to move from here. I hope I can spend the rest of my days here.
You know, people will rally round if something goes wrong. Yeah, there's always somebody there to help you, that's for sure.
The name Pill, that's a very interesting question. It very probably originates from the Welsh word pill, and there are many Welsh pills, Newport pill, etc., and probably was adopted over on this side as well. Some say it's got an Anglo-Saxon origin. I think the Welsh word is very similar and is probably it. We were originally known as Crochan Pill due to the ham green pottery being offloaded here from the creek. And that changed over the years to crock iron, which is very colloquial, crock ham, and then just got dropped completely.
Well, the word Pill is a creek or an inlet off a river.
There's creeks all the way up. I mean, there's St Catherine's Creek at Ham Green, Crochan Creek here, Morgan's Pill halfway down the river, and then you go round and there's Portishead, Clevedon, and over in South Wales.
The importance of the river to Pill is the same as an artery to a body, really. Without the river, I don't think Pill would ever have existed. And quite possibly, without Pill on the river, commerce in Bristol would have not flourished as it did, because the river at Pill is the ideal stopping off point for shipping, trying to go up or down the river without engines, which is for centuries how things were here. So the river and Pill are totally intertwined with its own survival, really.
In the past, it was vital because, I mean, it was the main area for the whole of the district, not only here, but all the neighbouring villages round, because most of the people here in the good old days were mariners, pilots and such like.
So you had the ship's butcher and other purveyors in the village that depended on the river. And then you had the hobblers who pulled the boats up and down, all working on the river. Get into St George's registers, and you'll see it, hundreds and hundreds, all the births, deaths and marriage, and it's all waterman, pilot, waterman, because of course the waterman covered everything, everyone who worked on the water.
Difference between a pilot and a hobbler. Oh my God, you could get me tarred and feathered for this. I think if we go back far enough, what we're just talking about is men from Pill working on the river with very specific knowledge that people didn't have from anywhere else.
The pilots were the men that used to bring ships up channel into Bristol, Avonmouth or Portishead. The hobblers were the men that years before, before they had engines and that, used to tow them up the river, either with the hobbling boats or on the river bank. When you're talking about the hobbling boats that the hobblers used to use, they were about 17'6" long, and they were all flush planking, carved built with grown frames in them. I've got two in the creek there still now, which I rebuilt at different times. Well, these are boats that the family built. This first little white one down here is my youngest son's boat. The next one over is a bit muddy. She's about 120 years old. And the one farther over, another rowing boat, is about 140 years old. The sailing boat opposite it was, that must be about 30 years old, which another my son David built. And the farthest one over is one that I built About 1950, I think it was.
You know, some of the boys down there, they'd been into boating, and their father and their grandfather were the ferryman. You know, these guys were born with bloody fishtails, I think. Yeah, fantastic boys in boats. And a hobble is a casual job. And these blokes were casual workers. They'd take the jobs if and when it came along. If no ships come along, they didn't get any money. Yeah, the hobblers, they evolved from, you hear me refer to towmen. I'm not on about people who work on tugs. But they would tow ships up to Bristol.
There were men that were specifically involved in towing craft on the towpaths, and they would have used horses and, it is said, sometimes oxen. And on other occasions, they would have used big pulling boats with a number of men in to take ropes from the ships and guide them up to Bristol or back down river, whichever. That is where the division really lies, in towing, as opposed to piloting or steering a craft or taking responsibility for a craft.
When John Cabot sailed from Bristol, there was 2 men that run barges on the river here, taking supplies from Bristol Corporation down to forts that were on the river, and also the fort at Portishead. One man was named James Shepherd, the other one was named James Ray. James Ray is reputed to have piloted the Matthew, John Cabot's ship, out clear of the river there. And then afterwards, he was made the first pilot for the river. There was river pilots and channel pilots. The river pilots I remember was my grandfather, old Mr. Walt Rice, my father, Jack Rice, Mr. Cox, Mr. Dickens that lived down in the old custom house. And they used to be chartered to the shipping agents and shipping companies. They would then steer their ships up the river. The channel pilots used to keep their boat moored in Portishead, by the Portishead Pier, and they used to take a pilot from there down Channel, down to Lundy, or wherever they wanted to go.
I started piloting in the Port of Bristol 1978, initially as a dock pilot, then in 1990, when the 2 services combined, I became a channel pilot. During a little boy in the 50s, when I was watching all these ships go past, there were some favourite lines like the Lauritsen line. All their boats were painted red, which made them look a bit special, and they were all called Dan. They brought timber in from Scandinavia. Then you had the brass tea boats, and they brought timber in. Then you had the Russians. Yeah, it was like a high street, just watching. On completion of my grammar school, I had 1 season as a deck boy on a paddle steamer, the Cardiff Queen, and then I became a pilot apprentice. We were then sent away to sea until such time as you had sufficient sea time in and you could take your second mate's ticket. Having acquired a second mate's ticket, you could sit for first mate's certificate, and this was the minimum qualification to be a pilot. So really then you were expected to cruise until such time as someone said, "Come on, my son, there's a pilot's job." The watch I was in, we worked with 3 watches. I was a member of the Pearl Mafia, with the likes of Sam Vowles, Peter Simpkins, Chester Rickard, Robin Young. One of the biggest cargo ships that ever passed under the motorway bridge was the AB Liverpool. I was a pilot on there, and interestingly, I met the captain many years later, and he said, "I recognise you, pilot." And I said, "Usually that means I either did a good job or I bumped your ship." And he said, No, you did a good job. You took me up to Bristol. It's an experience I have had. Every shipmaster said have it, but I hope to Christ I never have to do it again. And the rest, as they say, is history. Finally, at 61, I thought I'd had enough, and I decided to retire. And now, sadly, because times changed, the apprenticeship system went out the window. So the pilot service just recruits from a pool of men with master's tickets. But there's no association with Pearl now, sadly. You know, after 500 years, I was the last one born in the village.
Heave ho, I'm the pride of the tide. I'm a pilot from Pill. I'll knock you down backwards with my big clappers. Yo-ho, I'm a pilot from Pill. Our skiff sails to the westward on the ebb tide, and we hail every incoming vessel we see. Yo-ho, I'm the pride of the Bristol tide. Yo-ho, I'm a pilot from Pill.
Oh, the ferry. Well, the ferry's been there since time immemorial. Who knows when it started.
It really came into its own with the opening of Avonmouth Dock and the development around the dock with work.
When my uncle worked as a ferryman, it is said that he would take the fare in the boat, which was overlooked by the old customs house. An old lady used to sit in the window knitting. She had a pincushion to her side, and for every person who crossed the ferry, she would put a pin in the pincushion. At the end of his shift, the ferryman had to walk to the watch house and pay in his takings for his shift. The money had to tally with the pins in her pincushion.
The hobblers used it. Well, they didn't take their bikes with them. They kept their bikes in the backyard of the Lamplighters pub, and they go across on the boat and then they cycle down the side of the river to work. And hundreds of bikes outside of the Lamplighters. They'd have different boats for different times. You know, if it was high water and it was 5:30 and people were coming home from work, they'd put the Pilsner on because that would carry about 30 people. You know, in the middle of the afternoon, they'd have the Nexus or the Nova, you know, paddling over with 5 people. And
We all loved Albert Sharp, who was the ferryman to us, Uggy. I remember some of the other ferrymen, but Albert was the last ferryman. And it was Albert's voice that used to float up on a dark night, a windy night, a rainy night. Didn't matter what the weather was. When it was the last boat, it was Albert shouting last boat. And I still think now that's what would be one of the loveliest sounds that I'd like to hear again. And I won't. I feel a bit sad. I feel really sad actually just thinking about Albert. He was a unique man and he had such a knowledge of the river, and he was so helpful with the young people coming on behind, the children who'd get into a boat and he'd say, I'll show you how to scull, I'll show you how to row. And he had endless patience. He'd just say, you know, he'd come up to the slip, there'd be 6 children standing there and he'd say, come on, I'll take you up the river. Albert was a very lovely, kind man, And he was our ferryman, and to me, he always will be our ferryman.
for us as a little boy, he was a magnet to us, playing down by the river. The hobblers, they'd be sat on the bank wall waiting to go to work, you know, and we're so bloody kids now, you know. Oh, we're swimming in the creek, you know, and everybody's watching us. And it's funny, we used to swim out to the ferry boats tied up in the middle, the relief boats, if you like. And we'd be on there, and the paddle steamers would come up. I mean, lovely waves. 11 people on this paddle steamer would be going, get back, as we were diving in the water. It's that one purser wireless operator was stood there with a big smile on his face. That's my son. That's my dad. You know, he knew that we were down there in the water, and yeah. But there was always someone watching us.
Well, when the bridge opened, it was not looked upon very favourably, to be honest with you. We were used to being a unique little island down in a little valley with one road in that went out and a ferry to the other side if we wanted to go to the other side. And, you know, I look back at those times and think that ferry was unique, really, absolutely unique.
Bertram Thomas was born in Springfield Road, Pill, in 1892, and is probably Pill's most famous son. At the outbreak of war, he joined the Somerset Light Infantry, was posted to Mesopotamia, and the war that was going on over there was essentially against the Turks, the Ottoman Empire. He stayed on after the war and joined the Foreign Service, and then progressed to become financial advisor to the Sultan of Oman. The Sultan of Oman apparently was a bit of a playboy who preferred going to India and enjoying the fruits of life in India instead of Arabia, and left Thomas to it. As the Grand Vizier, he was actually the Prime Minister and is recognised as the only Briton to be Prime Minister of a foreign country outside of the Empire or the Commonwealth. There was a battle between him and Harry St. John Philby, who had also gone through the Foreign Office and taken up a similar position in Saudi Arabia as an advisor to Abdulaziz ibn Saud, who set up the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. Their aim was, the last great challenge was to cross the Rub el Khali, the empty quarter in southern Arabia. But Ibn Saud told Philby categorically, no, you're not going. Thomas, being a pillboy, didn't bother asking permission, he sneaked off. Bertram Thomas never gave up his Christian beliefs, so he was quite brave in that he was entering the Rub el Khali with a bunch of Bedou. But the fact that he spoke Arabic with the local dialect, they obviously held him in very high esteem. And off he went. And went to the first watering hole they found, which was a westerly course. And one of the places that he went to, it was supposedly a lost city. It got swallowed by the sand, and it was also myth or legend that this was the site where some of the treasures from King Solomon's mines come from. So whether that was in the back of his mind as well, as a good pillboy. And from there, it was north virtually all the way to Doha in Qatar, where he was received and, of course, become world famous.
Well, talking about the railway in Pill, that must have been a real major change for people in this village, because it did mean that there was a big influx of navvies and craftsmen and artisans that came to the village to enable the viaduct to be built and the track laid. And that was around 1867. And they must have been very well known in the village at a time when not a lot had changed, really. Not a lot of strangers had come en masse.
There was a siding called Portman Shipyard Signal Box, and we used to race down there so we could get a lift up in the guard's van there. And if the train had started off, we used to run down the line there, meet the train and shout to the guard. This one particular guard was always known as Snowball. And we shout out, Snowball! And he'd put the brake on in the guard's van, and the train would be still steaming and a whole lot would be shuddering, and then the engine used to stop, and we used to get on and get a lift up.
We caught the 8 o'clock train, and I was a train prefect for my school. Oh, you had to try and keep an eye on the younger ones that were there, because the boys would get your hats and throw them out the window if you weren't careful. I remember you try to get up in the rack. There'd be a rack with mesh in for the luggage, and we'd do some sorts on them and sit up in the rack.
There'd be the boys on there who'd always try to chuck your satchel into Ham Green Lake when you stopped at Ham Green Hall.
If you went to Portishead, you'd always walk down the railway. When the railway got to Portishead, they got on the platform at Portishead, and there was a little turntable at the bottom. The engine used to go on there, turn round, come back up and catch up with the other, what was the back of the train.
And the signal box was on the left-hand side, on the Portishead side, but on the Monmouth Road side, there was a bank beyond that, and school children, we'd find strawberries down there, great big ones, not little wild ones, but so while we were waiting for the 8 o'clock train, we all went down and helped ourselves to the strawberries down there.
A load of the boys went down on the railway bank, where we also used to climb down and get strawberries and all sorts, and they went into one of the workmen's huts along the railway line and got some detonators. They used to put the detonators on the line, so when the train went over, there'd be an almighty explosion. And of course it got reported to the railway police, and I can remember Mr. Shaw, our headmaster, calling us into assembly. We were all sat down in the hall, and this man came and gave us the most wonderful, bloodthirsty talk about detonators and how your fingers would be blown off, your nose would be blown. We thought it was fantastic. We all wanted to go out and get some more. But
one chap that was a driver on the train, one of his favourite things was when the cows were in the field alongside the railway line, They used to put their head through the rails because it was a nice long grass on the rails there. And they used to put the steam on and they used to go tearing around the field. Yeah. Yes, he was a wicked perisher, he was.
It is said that the club, Lodway Cricket Club, started in 1867. It was started mainly in the early days when the railway line was being inserted between Bristol and Portishead line. There was plenty of labour force up there which wanted something to do at weekends. And I'm told they used to play rounders on Watchhouse Hill. In 1896, Lodway moved to a field opposite the Anchor Inn at Ham Green, which has been the home ever since. Brother and I used to go up there, see, we just loved cricket. And we'd have the odd game of cricket at Pill's school, who used to use the Lodway ground for their 1 or 2 games. There was a telegraph pole, light pole down the end of the road, 2 doors from us sort of thing. White wickets painted on there. And it might be howling gale tipping down around. Brother and I would be out with a few other kids. When I started playing, we had no junior teams. I was going out there because I just loved cricket. And I used to be told, get out the ground, you're not a member and all this. And he used to say, you boy, are you a member? Well, no, so I come up to score if they want to score, I'll score, you know. Get out. Oh, I used to go home crying. My dad said, what's going on? I said, Dad used to go mad. Fortunately, brother and I both had a bit of talent, I suppose you'd call it. We managed to get into the seconds at an early age, and I got in the first team when I was about 16. Playing with these blokes, I played for Somerset. And we still got this rotor up at Lodway, which had 2 horses, wooden shafts on. And it was all we had in those days. It took about 8 of us, young'uns, to pull it out from the side, get it out to the middle and roll the wicket. But you see, we had a chap called Bunce the butcher. He was he was a big bloke, strong as ox. He used to come out and pull it on his own. Oh yeah, he was big. I opened innings with him once over at Flaxbourne on the bank holiday Tuesday. He hit 1-6 right out of the ground, over the road, and they lost the ball. We never got it back.
Quote by one lady who visited Pill, Charlotte Clark. Yeah, what she thought of Pill.
To be short, the villainies of these wretches are of so heinous and uncivilised a nature, they render the place so unlike any other part of the habitable world, that I can only compare it to the antechamber of that abode we are admonished to avoid in the next life by leading a good one here.
Nearest thing she's seen to the antechamber. You know, yes, and the young son who swears the worst is the apple of his father's eye.
There are some few that don't belong to the boats that are reasonable creatures, and I am amazed that they can patiently bear to reside where there are such a numerous set of cannibals, a name they justly deserve, for I believe there are some among them who would not scruple to make a meal of their fellow creatures.
Yeah, my wife said, oh, I'm marrying a boy from Pill, and somebody said, oh, I'm ever so sorry. And it had a reputation because you've got 14 bloody ships up there full of drunken sailors, you know.
Pubs in Pill have come and gone in the same way as the tide comes up and down, really. But there's no doubt that throughout history, and right up to the present day, there have been an inordinate number of opportunities for seafarers and anybody else who wants to go out and imbibe in strong alcohol and tobacco. I can remember when all the pubs were up in Pump Square, the Swan, the Red Lion and the Waterloo.
So there were 5 or 6 pubs around that. That was the hub of the village, why all the streets went down there. Then there was another one round the corner called the Royal George or something. And where the Indian takeaway is, that was the Wellington, that was a pub as well. Up the hill was the Cumberland.
And further along the bank wall, the Rising Sun, and then the Star, and there are other houses in the village that were pubs that are still here now. So there's a lot to say about the pot houses of Pill. I think that's a story in its own right, really.
My father, Russell Collins, was born in Pill in 1917. He dictated to me the story of his life a few months before he passed away. As we were surrounded by pubs, every weekend there were fights in Pump Square. The Avonmouth boys would come over on the ferry. My mother insisted that we go inside early in the evening before the Avonmouth boys arrived. The local policeman, who was based in the police house next to the school, would arrive, but often there was nothing he could do and left them to get on with it. Many times, men were thrown into the creek during those fights. When I was about 7 years old, a boat called the Ettrick went aground at Horseshoe Bend. It tipped over on its side, and the general cargo washed out of the holds. I recall Fry's Five Boys chocolate, which we were eating for weeks. My parents did very well out of the salvage. At the top of our stairs we had a cupboard. My father took the latches off, put the loot in, which was mostly Puritan soap and woodbines, and wallpapered over it so the customs men would not find out.
The thing that most linked Pearl to the Methodists was the fact that it was ripe and ready to be saved from drunkenness and iniquity by someone. And Wesley obviously was that someone. The American monument was put up because Asbury went over to found Methodism in America from here. There were also good reasons why people attended the open-air Methodism meetings, and that was that if the press gangs were coming into the village and an open-air Methodist meeting was called and men were attending to that, the press gangs would usually leave them in peace and go away. But then I think probably the word did spread and people did begin to see the benefits of changing their lifestyle, and that's how Wesleyanism began in this village.
So there was the Methodists, the Baptists, the Salvation Army. Quakers used to be, in the good old days, at the mouth of the river. We didn't have a church in Pure. We only had a chapel of ease for the for the seamen, etc., because it was St George's at East Ningadeno in those days, and you had your funerals, weddings, everything up there.
Because that's why people can't understand why that's called Church Path Road. You know, it's going to Eastern Church, not Pill Church. Because it used to go up there, up through where the footpath on the left-hand side of Newsom Avenue is now, across there, down through the village allotments. And the path was metalled, actually. But there were big kissing gates there, you know, and they weren't for kissing. They could lift them off and carry a coffin through on your shoulder to walk to the church.
But in 1860, they decided they would like to have a church here. So that church was built. Then that was blitzed in the war.
One of the bombs, it was an incendiary, hit the church, and I believe it went down behind the organ pipes, which meant that it was inaccessible.
The church was locked up as well. Nobody could get in there, and the incendiary bomb went down through the roof and around by the organ area. It started, they tell me, and burnt it out.
And it so happened that on that night, which was bitterly, bitterly cold, there was a big freeze, and the firemen couldn't get the pumps to work. So the women and people that were left in the village that were not away fighting the war formed buckets and chain and carried water to the church. And my mother always used to tell us the story about her and her sister Christine, how they ran out and they had buckets and they were passing the buckets along, but they were flicking it on each other. And Charlie Yelland from the Railway Inn came down and said to them, "This be no time for frolicking, my maids." And when he ran back up to the pub, the stables at the back of the pub were also on fire. Fortunately, the horses came out.
In that same blitz, there was a bungalow which an old lady lived in over by Harold Thomas's, just alongside the viaduct. And that got burnt out as well. Down Marine Parade, there was Bert Dickens and another chap during the blitz was stood in the doorway, and a bomb dropped in the road in Marine Parade and exploded and went up, and they were stood in the door of this house, but the blast went straight up and they weren't hurt at all. And there was the house that we lived in at Avon Road. We had an incendiary bomb. Community tiles come down, you got the eaves underneath. The incendiary bomb broke the tiles and come down through the eave casing out and fell in the garden there. Never did any other damage, just made a hole through the working. And when these places got burnt out in Pill, looking down across towards Avonmouth, across the Salt Ends, it was a maze of fairy lights where the incendiary bombs there, and you could walk down the fields afterwards and you could see like patches of lime where the incendiary bombs had dropped and burnt out. They've got the wrong side of the river, like for the dock.
I hope the village retains its character. As I was saying, in the 1800s, people did stay here, and that's what uniquely enabled families to stay together and work together, because the pilots and the hobblers all came from village families and had their own traditions. I'd like to see Pill retain its uniqueness. It will have to move forward, as everything does, but I think as long as we continue to have all the fun that we do and the attitude that we do to life and the resistance to the things that could possibly hurt us, the willingness to rise up with indignity when we don't like things that are being forced upon us, I think Pill will survive. If it retains that old spirit, I think it will move forward and take up things that are important and reject those that aren't. As long as Pill keeps its fighting spirit, I think it's got a future that will be very much about how it has always been.